aggressive dosing. Now, I get this, even for the females that are risk averse, even for individuals who are in bikini wellness. Shit, I've worked with figure competitors who are like, hey, I understand that my division requires a certain degree of muscularity, yet I don't want to incur that so quickly because I plan to do that over the course of several years. So if I'm going to use multiple cycles, I want to do it at a pace that supports me preserving my femininity. And then if that changes, potentially consider escalating from there. So when I say aggressive dosing, what I mean is starting not necessarily at the lowest dose possible and assessing. I mean, you're starting at a dose that you've heard a fellow competitor take. You're starting at a dose that isn't necessarily the starting point. So with Anavar, that would be either 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams a day. That's important, a day as opposed to a week, which we see with our injectable steroids. So Primo, Masteron, those are really the only two I'm going to consider using for a female athlete. That would look closer to 15 to 30 milligrams over a week. Now, I get it. Like, I understand it. I've used Anavar before. I have been on TRT for 3 years at this point. It is very tempting to go into a season where you're going to use PEDs, you were trying to achieve growth. Maybe you're coming off, a phase where you're a little salty because that prep, you did not perform the way that you were hoping to. And you have this idea, you have the hope, which I get that. You were hopeful that just using a little bit more will allow you to make faster progress. And very well, like that could be the case objectively. But that isn't the framework I would follow. And all of this is not to be taken as medical advice. I'm not a provider. I'm not a prescriber. I finished nursing school. I didn't even take my boards yet. Soon, pending. But within this, you have to understand that, like, if you can get, and this is, I guess you don't have to understand, this is my thought process. If I can get some out of 2.5 milligrams of Anavar or some out of 15 milligrams of Primo a week versus a day, I would rather do that and do that for as long as I need to. And I mean, specifically with anabolics, there is a cutoff in the amount of time I would continue using them, but I would approach it in a way that allows me to get the most out of the least. Now, this is predominantly why I would recommend, before using any kind of anabolic, to very first, at the beginning, prior to, if you are like, hey, I'm dead set on using the anabolic, this is where I think it makes the most sense to start with TRT. And this is very much the case if I have girls come to me who are like, hey, I'm going to do it either way. This is literally a client of mine right now. I'm like, yo, like, I don't recommend it. Here are all the reasons why. Like, I've crafted this argument against it. She's like, respectfully, I'm going to do it. Is this something you're going to help me with? Can definitely understand, like, some coaches who are not comfortable with that, kind of, relationship with her. I mean, she's definitely willing to listen to my dosing and duration guidelines, even though I think it's too soon for, where she's at in her career and her goals at hand. It's still something I'm like, listen, I'd rather you follow my advice. I'd rather be able to guide you relatively safely, even if I think it's premature. It is still your prerogative to decide that you want to use it. And once I walked her through what I would like to do in terms of like mapping out the timeline and specific things I would like to instill prior to, I do feel like we're pretty aligned in terms of what this is going to look like and what she can expect. But this is very much favorable as opposed to sending her to another coach, them putting her on 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams of the wrong compound. So potentially using an injectable as opposed to an oral while in I think I've reversed that. Potentially telling her to use an oral as opposed to an injectable, even though we know that technically she could use one, she could use either, but it would be more preferable for her to use the injectable when in a build. Mistake number 4, pyramiding their dose. And this kind of leads into, or I guess ties back into mistake number 3, aggressive dosing. Individuals really putting emphasis on like the sensation and the experimentation with like, well, if I got this out of 5 milligrams, what would I get out of 10 milligrams? What would I get out of 15 milligrams? And in this case, I'm specifically referring to Anavar, but the same rule of thumb, same logic can be applied to someone who, let's say, is taking an ancillary anabolic, so Anavar, Primo, Masteron. They're taking it in an off-season setting, but they're taking it over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And during that time, they are pyramiding up. So maybe they're doing like for Primobolan, maybe they're doing 15 milligrams a week for the first 2 weeks. Then they're doubling that to 30 milligrams a week. Then they're doubling that to 45, doubling it, so on, and then coming back down. What you have to understand is that overall lifetime exposure, that includes like dose, duration, and the amount of cycles that you run with a specific compound, but just across the board, any anabolics. That eventually is going to catch up to you. That is what we can use to infer the likelihood that you're going to viralize. So people will typically ask, like, okay, well, if I wanted to start, let's say, a very low dose, could I leave it in longer? Or what if I did start a more aggressive dose, but I left it in a shorter amount of time? I do think that there is something to be said about using the lowest dose possible for only the necessary amount of time needed. But there still is a threshold in which I would say you need to have the anabolic in place. So individuals who are just cutting shy of that 5-week mark, I believe it was Broderick Chavez who was talking about this in one of his Q&As, and him posing the idea of like, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense because it's like you're using this to enhance what you're going to get throughout that 5-week mark. We know relatively the time frame in which you can use anabolics and you shouldn't necessarily viralize is anywhere from 5 to 8-ish weeks. At least that's what has been reported anecdotally. And I mean, even within my own clients, like I can tell you, having them run a cycle 6 to 8 weeks, that's typically what I lean into. That's typically what I prefer. And within that, I have not had clients viralize at these lowest doses possible, going through a cycle anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. What I think you really have to understand, though, is that this very micro cycle that people are becoming more and more favorable to, these 2, 3, 4 week cycles, I don't feel like you're really able to accrue any kind of meaningful amount of tissue during that time with the anabolic in place. So to me, this is just completely anecdote, just opinionated. I don't think that's long enough to really warrant the use of it. I would rather someone commit to anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, decide that okay, assuming I'm not viralizing, assuming I'm not seeing changes, I'm going to have it in place. And then pending those results, I can then determine how much muscle did I actually gain and is the second cycle needed.